Welcome back to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. Today I am talking to Peter S. Williams, Christian philosopher and apologist. He is Assistant Professor in Worldviews and Communications in LA University College, Norway. He explains what philosophy is and why it is important to teach it. Also, why rhetoric and the Socratic teaching approach are important to philosophy. Peter describes Christian apologetics as a sub-discipline of theology focused on persuading people that a Christ-centered spirituality is a reasonable, good, and beautiful way of life, one that virtuously integrates our assumptions, attitudes, and actions. For those wanting a vocation in theology, we define what that is and how it can be planned for in a home-educating family. As we talk, I am increasingly aware of how much the discipline of philosophy is important in a society that needs to learn to talk, debate, and argue in a healthy way again. We can learn alongside our children. Peter has also given us a comprehensive list of books for homeschooling families to give serious consideration to. He saved a lot of time by pointing us in the right direction. You'll find these in the description box below. Before we get started, please take a moment to subscribe to my podcast channel if you haven't already. Well, good morning to you, Peter, and thank you so much for agreeing to come onto our homeschooling podcast. Really looking forward to the advice and insight you give to our homeschooling families. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be able to join you today.
Excellent. Great start. Peter, perhaps for our listeners, could you please tell them what you are doing? What's your elevator pitch?
My elevator pitch. Well, although I'm based in England, I work part-time for a Christian university college in Norway, in Kristiansand in the south of Norway, and I have an official job title there, which is the Assistant Professor in Communication and Worldviews. And that title kind of is used as an umbrella term that accommodates the fact that I'm a Christian philosopher. I'm also a Christian apologist, and I'm particularly interested in what the ancient Greek thinker Aristotle called rhetoric, that is, how to communicate ideas persuasively to people, or how to help people recognize what is persuasive about the things that you're trying to communicate to them about. So we could kind of take those kind of one at a time very briefly. Philosophy, you could say, is the subject that deals with the very basic questions that underlie all of the other subjects one would study at a university. So one of the nice things about philosophy is that it pairs with anything that you're interested in life. So if you're interested in science, there is a subject of the philosophy of science. If you're interested in the arts, well, there's a subject of the philosophy of beauty and aesthetics and art and so on. So you could think of a philosopher as someone dedicated to kind of the wise pursuit and dissemination or communication of true answers to really significant questions through thinking and arguing well about things. That would be my kind of description of what a philosopher is. Now, there's a bit of an overlap between philosophy as a Christian and Christian apologetics. Apologetics, terrible word in English, again, because it sounds like you're talking about apologizing to people, but it comes from an original Greek word used in the New Testament, indeed, that is talking about giving a defense or a reason for what you believe. So apologetics it's just a sub-discipline of theology that focuses on persuading people that a Christ-centered spirituality is a reasonable thing, a good thing, a beautiful way of life, if you like. That is a way of life or spirituality that virtuously integrates our head and our heart and our hands, or to alliterate in another way, our assumptions about reality, our attitudes to reality, and the actions that we take in reality. Can you tell that I was brought up Baptist listening to 3-point sermons? Now, because every spirituality, every way of life includes some assumptions about the world, some worldview, ideas about the nature of reality that you believe or kind of act on the basis of, there's, of course, a big overlap between apologetics and philosophy. Both of them have an overlap with rhetoric, which, as I say, is about trying to communicate ideas persuasively or help other people to recognize what you have discovered to be persuasive about whatever, and in this case about Christianity or following Christ. Yeah.
I'm interested in the term rhetoric that you mentioned early on, the communication of good ideas. Can you please unpack a little bit more what rhetoric, teaching in a rhetoric manner and therefore learning to think in a rhetoric manner, what that looks like?
This is kind of a Greek term that has become kind of decried within our culture, because we would often tend to use the word rhetoric in a kind of dismissive way, I guess, when we say, oh, that politician's speech, it was just rhetoric. But the Greeks would have said that rhetoric is about the persuasive, yes, communication of ideas, or of how to talk, particularly to an audience, in a persuasive way, but not necessarily in a manipulative way. Aristotle would have seen kind of manipulative rhetoric as bad, but rhetoric doesn't have to be manipulative. It can be, as I say, about making objective observations about what is good or true or beautiful, that is attractive to us in those ways that truth and goodness and beauty are attractive. That, you know, the true is what's worthy of belief. The beautiful is what is worthy of our desire. The good is that which is worthy of our choice. And to help people to recognize when things are true or good or beautiful, and thus worthy of our being attracted to them in those ways, and to help people to see that, communicating that in what you say to people. Aristotle broke, just to go a little deeper, he kind of broached three kind of main categories of rhetoric. He would talk about logos, or the rational communication, kind of argumentation, persuading through good arguments. And there's kind of an overlap there with the whole field of logic in philosophy, making good arguments. Then there is the categories of ethos. We would talk today about what's the ethos of the school, the ethos of an organization. The kind of, does the person who's speaking to you and trying to convince you about something seem to be trustworthy and reliable? Do they have a good character that comes across that makes you trust what they're saying, or do they come across like a kind of stereotypical used car salesman, as it were? And the third and final category is pathos, which is about the heart and moving the audience's feelings, or I like to link it to, again, getting the audience to recognize what is attractive in the sense of beautiful about a subject. Think of the way in which in music we have Tchaikovsky wrote the Pathétique symphony. It comes from the same pathos root of word. And again, in English, it's not saying, oh, that symphony is really pathetic, it's really bad, but rather it's a symphony that really moved your feelings, full of pathos, and really moved you. But again, as I say, not using techniques to manipulate people like is often the case in advertising, but rather using the best way to help people to see what really is objectively true or good or beautiful about a subject, and thus to be moved to embrace that thing that you're communicating about.
I was just thinking before that there's a fine line between using good rhetoric and being manipulated emotionally to be able to be persuaded in a certain way. And I can see that there would be genuine confusion. People think that they were using rhetoric when all they're doing is manipulating the listener. And I'm thinking perhaps for me, one of the ways of discerning whether rhetoric was true and noble rhetoric, an honourable moving of the feelings as opposed to manipulative, would be, is it open to argument or debate? So can the person who is trying to get you to think in a certain way, how do they respond when you question them? Do they get angry or defensive? That would be a clear thing to me. And also closely connected is, can the person who is on the receiving end of this misplaced rhetoric, do they know how to think logically in order to balance that up?
Yes. So these kind of three big areas of rhetoric can be combined with one another. And also, I think rhetoricians, and one of the things that I'm very keen to do as a rhetorician or as a teacher in general, is to teach, not only to kind of use the tools of rhetoric, but to teach the tools of rhetoric to other people, to teach people how to think and argue about things, and kind of what the rules of argumentation that I'm using are, so that they can hold me accountable to the same ground rules that we're all kind of equally assessing things on the basis of. And to teach people that when I'm talking about goodness and beauty, for example, I mean things that are intrinsically, objectively good and intrinsically, objectively beautiful. I'm not just talking about a kind of subjective, good for this culture or for that culture, kind of beautiful to me or whatever. I think a statement like rainbows are beautiful, I think that's a true statement about reality. I think that's something we discover about rainbows, not something that we invent or kind of impose upon rainbows. And you can start breaking down different kind of aspects of what makes a thing beautiful, about its existence, about its purpose, about how it achieves its purpose. So we can say, for example, we can talk about the beauty of a really efficient engine, and the efficiency of that engine is part of the beauty of that engine. And you can compare engines and see, one is more efficient than another. So there's the beauty of the efficiency of its way that it works. But then there's also the beauty of what is trying to be achieved by a designed thing. Is it a good outcome or not? And you can compare the outcomes and the methods of artifacts with one another. Those are kind of different aspects of the beauty of those things, and so on. So you can kind of start drilling down into teaching people that there's a kind of set of standards here that we can hold one another accountable to as we're talking about these different aspects of rhetoric. And that gives you the ability to say, hang on a minute, Pete, you're wrong about that. And actually, you've taught me how to notice that you're wrong about that. So that sense of mutual accountability that is produced by teaching the ground rules of how to make these observations and communicate them between people.
I think in eras gone by, that was the common way of educating. And what I observe more and more is that for the last couple of generations, it was moved over to a new way of educating. So we've had at least a couple of generations actively discouraged from asking the questions of why or what, and moving more and more strongly now till it's nowadays, I observe, this is just common educational method. You're told what to think, and you're actually actively discouraged from questioning or how to think. There has also been a growing trend at the moment, Peter, I don't know if you can also see this, where classical education is starting to gain in popularity after dropping off for some years. And when the parents are asked about this, it's born of a realization that something is wrong in our education system, and they're returning to a classical education. But if a homeschooling family are wanting to pursue this, unless that parent has been educated in rhetoric or Socratic or both, they actually need to be taught how to do this. The biggest reason I really want you just to download for the listeners today is to equip them to be able to do this, because you've had to learn to do it yourself. You're teaching how to do it. Yeah. And there are people who really, really want to learn. So they're the ones I've got in mind today, which reminds me of another question that I just jotted down now. What is the difference, or what is the relationship between the rhetoric method of education and the Socratic?
Talking about Socratic, or Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, whose pupil Plato was, and we know of Socrates through a couple of different ancient Greek writers, but he features heavily in the works of Plato, who wrote these philosophical dialogues between different characters and used Socrates as a central character in a lot of his philosophical dialogues, where he portrays Socrates as someone who was wise in as much as he knew that he didn't know a lot. And went around asking people who thought they knew a lot questions about things, and asking questions like, what is justice? Do you know what justice is? The other characters would say, yes, of course I know what justice is. It's X, Y, or Z. And then Socrates would ask probing questions of them to make distinctions about things, and would ask questions like, famously on justice, are things just or right because the gods declare that they are? Or do the gods declare a thing to be right and just because they are? And would basically end up tying the people he was in conversation with up in knots that kind of revealed that although they thought they knew what they were talking about, really they didn't have a clue. So it's not that kind of Socrates is meant to be this kind of know-it-all figure, but he is kind of pricking the false pomposity or aspiration to knowledge of the people around him, which got him into a lot of trouble. And historically speaking, Socrates was put on trial for kind of disturbing the youth of Athens. They sentenced him to death by drinking poison, which he went through with. So he became this kind of martyr figure to early Greek philosophy, and asking questions about things, and asking questions to reveal, do we really know what we're talking about? How do we, this kind of central philosophical task of what do we mean by? And you'll often hear kind of, when you ask a philosopher a question, they will often start a reply with, well, it depends what you mean by X, Y, or Z. So a lot of philosophy is about getting clear, careful definitions about things, particularly in the kind of analytic tradition of philosophy that became big in the 20th century in the Anglo-American kind of philosophy world, of careful definitions. I'm very keen on kind of combining that analytic, careful definition about things approach to philosophy with that kind of classical, but we're interested in the big questions of life, the tradition. Socrates the ancient Greeks were particularly interested in philosophy as a kind of approach to how do we live a wise life? What is the good life? The kind of ethical and political emphasis of a lot of philosophy at that time. It had a very kind of practical focus, in a sense. People can sometimes think as philosophy as, because it can get quite abstract and about how do we define things, that's not practical. But Socrates would have and Plato would have pointed out how practical it is to know what we're talking about. When you talk about Socratic, to me, that's what, from my background, it brings to mind, but particularly trying to educate not just by kind of downloading information to people, but through having dialogues with people that hold their feet to the fire, if you like, of having careful definitions consistently used across things, and asking people to make distinctions between things until we work out what exactly we're talking about, what exactly we mean.
It could be quite threatening for many adults who are established and comfortable in what they would just regard as standard, correct, theology or a way of looking at life or a worldview. So have to have your own view of things peeled off like a painful onion, layer after layer, could be quite threatening. My personal feeling is that as a parent starting to do this too, is that have the courage to look carefully at what you just take for granted, but go at it gently and slowly. You're in no hurry to dismantle or query or look under your own personal rocks.
And the point of the exercise is not really the dismantling. It's that the dismantling is in pursuit of the truth. You have to start with the idea that there is something that's true. There is something that is good to be. It's like, what is the good life? You're assuming there is a good, there is a true, there is a beautiful that you're trying to get at. And that being confused about what you mean by things, being confused about what you're talking about, of course, gets in the way of getting at that truth. And so asking questions like, well, what do you mean by that? Raising difficulties with people's understanding or definition, saying, looking for counterexamples to distinctions or ideas, or saying, how would you handle thinking about this counterexample or this situation or whatever? Can you consistently use that definition through these different situations and so on? Is in pursuit of getting a clear idea of what is true and good and beautiful. And so there's ultimately a positive and kind of building up intent with the tool. It's not just like, here's a stick to hit people over the head with to show them that they don't really understand the world, which it could be. Again, that would be kind of a misuse of that practice ultimately.
Yes, it would be rather manipulative. That couldn't be logically defended. All right, then. Thank you for that definition there. That's helpful to me, and I hope to others who need to know that. Bearing in mind then that philosophy undergirds the apologetic approach and also what we term as worldview. For Christian homeschooling families in particular, why are these things even important to the church and by ripple effect to the culture outside of us? Why should we even bother?
Well, I think apologetics and worldview are important not just to the church or to Christians, but in a sense to everyone. And let's start with these basic categories of the true and the good and the beautiful, which the ancients called the transcendental values. They apply in all sorts of different subjects that you might study at a university, and they apply in our own lives as well. I've talked about the way in which I think of Christianity as a Christ-centered spirituality or way of life that tries to virtuously combine the contents of our head and hearts and hands. But I think everybody, every properly functional human, is trying to pursue a virtuous way of life that combines their head and their heart and their hands. It's just that different people put different content into those categories. To greater or lesser extent, there'll be overlap between different spiritualities, but there'll be some difference between a Buddhist spirituality or a Hindu spirituality or a Marxist atheist spirituality or Christian spirituality or what have you. But we're all interested in combining having a worldview, having certain attitudes towards the world, acting in a way that's consistent, that flows out of that combination of your head and your heart and so on. And we're all interested, of course, in noticing those things, being able to think well about them, being able to communicate those ideas and attitudes and so on to other people, and trying to persuade other people to adopt this or that belief or attitude or practice in life. We have to do that on some kind of common ground. You have to be able to argue well with other people in order that you're not just left with getting the kind of argument that's threatening or getting hot under the collar, or you want to actually reasonably persuade people about things. Even when we're disagreeing with one another, I think we should try and do it in an agreeable, a reasonable, ethical manner.
You mentioned that you came from a Baptist background, so have we. And listening to you, I would be very happy if it became a compulsory part of electing church leadership, not just the pastor. That should be a given that he or she is trained in philosophy, but other church leadership. Because I have seen many strong Christians manipulate a church body and getting them to believe that something was from God when really it was their own opinion. So there we go. That's how it can, that's why it's important to the church by itself.
I definitely, in my teaching with my students, I try at least to put an emphasis on teaching them how to think and make evaluations of things. Philosophers are used to making how they're arguing very explicit and kind of saying, here is my argument. Here are the premises of my argument, which link together to lead you through to this conclusion. And these are the kind of the ground rules that you judge whether or not that's a good argument. So I'm putting my own kind of neck on the line. And I'm not just trying to kind of tell you what to think, but I'm telling you how to think about it, how to make evaluations for yourself. And then on that basis, I will say, and here's what I think and why. Please feel free to disagree. And actually, we all need to help one another in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of the true and the good and the beautiful. That, as the proverb says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.
I'm thinking of he was an elderly man, a lecturer back in Bible college. So I'm talking, coming up 40 years ago. And as a young one, I was only 21. I just assumed that somebody who was long in the tooth when it came to faith, there's nothing really else for them to learn. But he said one day, well, two things: never use the Holy Spirit as an excuse for laziness. And the other one was his clear expectation that every time he went to the scriptures, he expected to grow, be challenged, questioned in his faith, so that his knowledge of the truth just grew and grew and grew. And, if they were the only two things I ever got out of my years there, that would have been worth it. Because you're right, we never stop having to ask questions of ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, the church has been grappling with understanding and correctly interpreting the scripture for 2,000 years. So to think that we're, as an individual, going to get to the bottom of it within a single human lifetime, particularly without help from other people, is somewhat hubristic, right?
True. All right, so let's move on and hone down for the homeschooling family, or let's say the students who want to prepare for a vocation and they're feeling called, or called will do, into a specifically theological vocation. So to define that, as I did when you emailed me backwards and forwards, what I mean by a theological vocation is a particular theological subcategory, such as they want to go into biblical research, or he wants to become a lecturer in theology, or she wants to explore Old Testament archaeology with a view to interpreting the script. That kind of theological, it's precise, but it's quite broad. So let's say we've got a family that want to head down that track there. What do you recommend them to do? What books, podcasts, thinkers, teaching, what should they be concentrating on?
Yeah, I think even in the way that you raise that question, right, the struggle that you're having to kind of, again, back to what do you mean by, right?
Yes.
This is very important. Notice that the broad way in which you kind of raise that and say, you might be interested in archaeology, or you might be interested in, I think that's right. Theology is a highly interdisciplinary subject, as philosophy is as well in some senses, and apologetics. These are all subjects where I think it's really good to retain a broad interest in the world and to kind of keep your educational learning options open and broad for kind of as long as possible as you can. In my own case, when I first went off to university, I went to Cardiff University in Wales, and their humanities teaching there, they, in the first year, made you take 3 different humanities subjects. And I went with the intention of doing a joint degree in English literature and music. And I took philosophy as this subject that hadn't even been available to me at pre-university, we call A-level here in the UK. And I kind of stumbled across philosophy as a subject at university for the first time and kind of fell in love with it. I disliked the, at that time, very postmodern English literature department. And I discovered that although I loved music, I'd come to it a bit late in life in terms of learning instruments. And I only had grading exams on 1 instrument, and you needed it in 2 instruments to carry on past the first year to do composing, which was my kind of central interest in music. And so I ended up switching to philosophy and discovering philosophy at university. But I think my interest in literature kept with me in my philosophy, in my thinking about apologetics in a very broad way, and thinking that, yes, apologetics needs to be concerned about truth, but also it can be concerned about, well, how a worldview is expressed in the arts, and how can we use art to communicate worldview in a persuasive way, and so on. As you mature educationally, you may discover things that you didn't even know about earlier on, and things that you can combine into such an interdisciplinary subject as philosophy or apologetics and theology are. So I would say, first of all, think in a broad way, be interested in the whole of God's world, and always be thinking as you're studying different subjects, how do I as a Christian relate this subject to my faith in God, to the biblical world view as I understand it, and so on. You have this kind of double thinking, not just thinking in terms of how the textbooks present a subject, but okay, here's this subject being presented to me at the university or in a textbook or whatever, but also should I as a Christian be thinking about that and approaching that, and integrating that with my Christian spirituality. And that will give you a really good basis. And then you can pursue in these interdisciplinary subjects things that you're really interested in and passionate about at that kind of more kind of detailed level. Like, I'm really passionate about history and archaeology, or I'm really passionate about the arts and painting or whatever. And then you can combine that with your interest in theology or apologetics or what have you. And secondly, of course, I'm going to say this as a philosopher, but a really good grounding in how to argue well, how to make and assess arguments in logic, in that logos part of rhetoric, is really crucial in whatever subject you're studying, thinking about, to be able to assess the arguments that are being made there, to think, how do I integrate this with my Christianity, and so on, will stand you in good stead. And thinking in these kind of transcendental categories of what it really is true and good and beautiful here, and not being put off by an educational system, as you were saying earlier, that the kind of changes in education, as a kind of modernist worldview took over from what we might call more kind of pre-modern religious worldviews in educational world. Well, it retained the interest in what's true, although it tended to pursue it through a very kind of science-only, a scientistic kind of way, but retained an interest in truth, but ditched the idea that goodness and beauty are objective things to be discovered. Kind of modernism said that those goodness and beauty are values that we create, or they're relative to your culture. And postmodernism went even a step further and kind of ditched the idea that we can get at objective truth, that we can get beyond our worlds to actually know reality. Whereas Christianity, or at least we could say kind of pre-modern Abrahamic worldviews, retain this sense that the true and the good and the beautiful, like the ancient Greeks thought, but also like the Bible says, are discoverable realities are really there. St. Paul talks about whatever is morally true, whatever is worthy of praise, to think about such things. Paul is no postmodernist saying, whatever you happen to like. He's talking about those things that it is good to like, that you should be attracted to. You have to kind of filter the way in which secular culture approaches some of these things and kind of reconceptualize these subjects from a kind of Christian worldview, and having some grounding in philosophy and these kind of basic categories that we've been thinking about are a good basis for starting to do that, even if you don't go, further into the philosophical rabbit warren, as it were.
So you could start teaching children at a reasonably young age, at least an introduction level. How do you do that, though? Because a child, generally when they're under the age of 10, they're very concrete in their thinking, and an abstract, more thoughtful way of thinking doesn't tend to come in until they're around maybe between 10 and 12. So do you think that whole questioning rhetoric way of teaching should be more around that age group?
I think this is where you have to kind of know your individual child a bit, because whatever, you can make generalizations about child development and so on, but you have to also then recognize, you have an individual before you. Know your individual, and you can kind of just start out with just occasionally trying a kind of dialogue, a kind of, what do you think this means? Why, asking questions. Why do you think that? What would you say to someone to try and get them to agree with you? What would you say to someone who held a different opinion about who said this instead? Kind of start those cogs turning. And the very basics of kind of logical argumentation, they're not all that complex. I used to say to secondary school pupils or kind of A-level pupils that I would try and teach this to, that, if you can operate a toaster, you can do logical argumentation. The kind of steps of how to do this, are not much more complicated than the booklet that you get with, how to operate a toaster. The idea that we make claims about things. We say, this is true, and we make statements. That's different from making an argument. In an argument, you have to have more than one statement. You have to have at least two different claims about reality. You have to say things like, to use a classical example, Socrates is immortal. That's one statement. Socrates is the kind of thing that dies, right? And if I make another claim, now I'm going to define mortals. Mortals die. All mortals die. It follows from those two statements that Socrates will die. Okay? You can see that if those two claims about reality are true, then this third claim must also be true. And that's an argument where you have at least two claims that kind of point you to a conclusion. There are only three rules that govern whether an argument is a good one or not. If I say, all footballs are round, all onions are round, therefore footballs are onions. Well, that's ludicrous, even though I've got two statements and a conclusion. There are rules that make a difference between a good argument and a bad one. When a particular word or a term is repeated, does it mean the same thing? So you're avoiding kind of doublespeak or ambiguity. Are all of the truth claims in the argument true? Because if one of them is false, then the argument won't work. And does the conclusion really follow? So if I were to say, generally speaking, high-fat food is bad for you. Some yogurt is high in fat. Therefore, all yogurt is bad for you. Well, you can see that conclusion doesn't follow from the two premises, because I had a statement that made a claim about some yogurt, and I've now stated a conclusion about all yogurt. The conclusion that should follow is, of course, some yogurt is bad for you. An example of ambiguity that I use, I like using these jokey examples. So if I say, a plane is a carpenter's tool, you use it for planing a wooden surface smooth, right? The Boeing 747 is a plane. You'll notice it's the same word, spelt the same way in English. If I then try and draw the conclusion, therefore, the Boeing 747 is a carpenter's tool, right? Ridiculous conclusion. What's gone wrong? Well, what's gone wrong is I've played on this ambiguity, the fact that when the term plane appeared in different premises of that argument, it meant different things. And that allows you to kind of pull a trick. So in arguments, you want to check that when a term reoccurs, that's a crucial term, it means the same thing. It means something consistent. That's the basic of logical argumentation. So there's very little to kind of learn. What you have to do, like any skill in life, is get used to using those rules. Practice with thinking, someone seems to be making an argument here. Let's kind of analyze it. Let's write it down in terms of premise, conclusion. Maybe a longer argument, be several little units of these kind of premise leading to some conclusion, and then another premise leading to another conclusion, and you can break it down into these little units of premise, conclusion, and so on, and just kind of get used to that skill of thinking in those terms, analyzing things, making arguments yourself. But it's not really very complicated to kind of get your head around, and you can talk about very kind of concrete things in those terms, rather than applying that skill necessarily to very kind of abstract and remote things.
I would like to move on to the state of our universities and what is a potential tertiary student to do. It is clear that in the West, our system is failing our children. For example, in New Zealand, and I can only state for New Zealand, around 50% of children when they finish high school are functionally illiterate and functionally innumerate to be able to get on in an adult world. Something's very wrong. Sometimes that is what reflects people choosing the homeschool route. Other times they try and mitigate within the system, or there's a transfer over to, we call them private schools, fee-paying schools, or faith-based schools. So there is a movement afoot to try and change things. There's a very small movement afoot at Ministry of Education level, but it takes a long time to shift a big ship. And when you consider that many teachers in the system were actually taught under the same system, you have a problem of teachers not really being able to teach at the level needed to up our levels again. Move that over on into a university situation. We've known for at least more than a decade, a physics teacher told us, lecturer I should say, at uni, that the students coming through into the university were so poorly educated in physics that they had to spend most of their first year reteaching them what they should have had at a high school level, which then means that they can't teach them, or some of their teaching is delayed, or they may not even get around to teaching some of what in the past a physics student in this example would have. We also have the problem, which is part of the bigger problem, is that most of our educational area in the public domain is now under cultural Marxism. So without philosophically breaking all that down, I'm just going to take that as a given, because we could, but we don't really have time in this. Okay. The output of that now means that most of the lecturers within our university system are also cultural Marxists, and that's the way they have now designed the tertiary system. What I don't know is how much that has affected Oxford and Cambridge, which tend to, I think, work more on the Socratic method of teaching. So I can't pass comment on that type of university. This is a big problem. Not so much in the STEMs, although we have got diversity, equity, and inclusion now starting to come over into those STEM subjects also. So it is starting to affect the outcome of those areas. Outside the universities going into the business world, you're hearing quite a few, especially business people, saying they either wouldn't even employ someone who came out with a BA or whatever, they would actually retrain them, or they're going to retrain them anyway, and their previous 3 years was really to get a degree to open one door, which seems to me to be a waste of time and money if that's the only reason you're getting a degree, is to open a door. Nevertheless, that stands. As a specific example, I'm going to tell you about a financial money manager who actually said he would not even employ someone who had been to university. What he would do is encourage those students who had an interest, in this case finances, to find good mentors over a period of what would have been 3 years for a degree anyway, work alongside that person or persons for 3 years, even if that you have to pay the mentor that, because you're going to pay fees to university anyway. So you're learning on the spot with people who are highly experienced and successful. And by the time you finish what would have been time-wise the equivalent of a degree, you would know more than what a student just coming out of uni would. You are already embedded in a network of, in this case, financiers. And you haven't wasted time in being made to do papers that had nothing to do with your subject, and they were just there as they were political. So we've got the scenario now starting to happen with solutions now coming back into the educational arena. And I also know of one university in the States, I think it's called Ralston, Ralston University, that is particularly moving away and going back to centre-right educational methodology. So there's no cultural Marxism in there at all. Now, that's a very long introduction to you to then go back to students who wish to study theology, philosophy, especially if they're picking this up in their homeschool teen years and they've already done most of or all of which a introductory, do you call them undergraduates when you do a bachelor?
Yeah, undergraduate, yeah.
They're probably, especially if they got excellent mentoring, they've done it. Now, if they wanted to save time and money by concentrating or concertinaing it into a certain period of time, can you envisage a way that type of strategic focused outcome can be then channeled into maybe moving on to do a PhD without having to go through the traditional university years? Is there anything you want to ask me about that? Have I made myself clear to the scenario that's starting to have flux?
It's difficult kind of strategizing to a kind of moving target, as it were, when you have a system in flux. If people are starting to try different ways of doing things, and it sounds to me that you're describing a kind of expansion of what we would traditionally think of as a kind of apprenticeship kind of route of education, which at least in the UK we would apply more to kind of trades, as it were, like becoming an electrician or a plumber or what have you, or courses that are connected very much to working in industry, where you might do some of your course in a university and have a kind of placement year in industry to get work experience, and you may be part funded by that industry to do your degree, because you're then going to go on and work with a particular company that's kind of sponsoring you through that, so that the company is kind of outsourcing some of your training to the university and providing some of it themselves, as it were, and so on. So that's a kind of hybrid, but it would depend upon knowing what the particular evolving opportunities kind of are, and also kind of knowing what you want to do very specifically, as I was saying earlier, about kind of keeping your options broad as long as possible, and balancing that with, if you think you have a very specific idea, and knowing if there's a specific alternative route that you can take that's open to you. Another alternative that maybe this would apply above the undergraduate level more, but doing courses online. I just recently took a postgraduate course completely online from Bournemouth University here in the UK in higher educational practice. That was 100% online. We give you access to our website. You work your way through the material on the website in your own time, and we'll have a few kind of group Zoom calls where you can ask questions, and when you're doing a particular paper you interact with a tutor to kind of reiterate some feedback on that. But it's kind of fairly minimal contact time, as it were. It's just jumping through the educational hoops at a kind of arm's length from the being involved in the institution. Yeah, it's going to depend upon knowing that there is a specific alternative route that you're keen and comfortable enough to take. At the moment, it seems to me that the kind of getting the key of having an undergraduate degree that then opens doors to you, particularly in subjects that are less kind of traditionally these kind of job specific subjects. Well, if you're talking about doing a degree in theology or philosophy, or I'm not sure at the moment if there is available an alternative route. You do have choices about, do you study those subjects at a secular institution or at a faith-based institution of some kind? Particularly when you get to, if you're thinking of apologetics, you can do some courses available online. But it sounds like an interesting move. I'd be interested to kind of see how you, through that route, get a kind of the key, the recognition, the kind of badge of I have done this and got this experience that you can then take to other people in a way that they will recognize. That, in a sense, is what the degree certificate does. It's kind of a kind of universal agreed standard of I've met this standard, and then it opens doors to you at other places they're going to kind of buy into that agreed system. It would be how this kind of alternative route manages to do that as well.
Peter, can you please talk about the difference between apologetics for believers and unbelievers?
Sure. Well, I think it's useful for both, but in the definition of apologetics that I work with, about helping people to see that following Christ is a reasonable, good, and beautiful way of life. You can think of that persuasion as being kind of an initial act of persuasion of getting someone to adopt a Christ-centered spirituality in the first place, or of helping and encouraging them to continue dedicated to a Christ-centered spirituality, a sort of ongoing commitment, because faith in Jesus is not a kind of one-off tick box exercise. You can cross it off your to-do list and then forget about it. It's an ongoing daily commitment. Apologetics can be of ongoing help to our discipleship. I see apologetics really as part of Christian discipleship in that sense.
So you've given me a wonderful list of books. It's quite comprehensive. Thank you. That they will be really helpful for people to be able to. But if people want to get hold of you, Peter, what's the best way to do that?
So I have a website at www.peterswilliams.com. My middle name is Stephen, so that S there is for Stephen. Peter S for Stephen Williams.com. And I have a contact form, email contact form on that website that folks can drop me an email by, and I will do my best to respond to questions and requests for info that are sent to me there. That website, whilst we're plugging it, will give you access to some of my papers for free, info about my books, link you through to my podcast, my YouTube channel. I should highlight my YouTube channel. I don't put a lot of videos out of me on my YouTube channel, but I curate a lot of YouTube playlists, as they're called. And I curate one of videos in which I appear, but I also have got a list of some 200 or so different playlists that I've put together on different apologetic and philosophical, theological topics. And I try to include in those playlists kind of short introductory videos all the way through to long lectures and debates on different topics as well. So I try and kind of cover a kind of range of amount of time that you'd have to put into and kind of level of complexity on those topics. But that might be a really good resource for your listeners, my YouTube playlists on my YouTube channel, which
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for those resources then. Then I thank you so very much, Peter, for your time. Really valuable for homeschooling families. Appreciate it very much.
I hope so. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.